So for our first speaker today, I have the honor of presenting Mr. Bilahari Kasukan. He is the chair of the Middle East Institute at U.S. He also has nearly 40 years of experience in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, including as ambassador to Russia. He will be talking about the Russia-Ukraine war today, as well as a lot of other issues going on in geopolitics and how that impacts trade. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Bilahari.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. I hope you don't come to regret it. But in any case, I hope that we can have a dialogue rather than just listening to me make a monologue. So I'm going to be pretty brief, maybe take about 15 minutes with my opening remarks. And then I hope to get questions from you. And I've told you all journalists, so I expect a flood of questions. Let me start with the war in Ukraine. I don't know if anybody, apart from Mr. Putin, expected the war in Ukraine to be short. But if you ever had that delusion, get rid of it, because it's obviously now going to be a very long war. I don't see any prospects for a diplomatic settlement of the war. We are still at a stage of the war where both sides at least say they think they can win. And the politics does seem to be against a quick settlement. After how many months? 100 and how many? I can't remember exactly. February, March, April, May, June, July. After 5 months. After 5 months of war, Mr. Putin is more or less where he started. He had Crimea before that. Large parts of Donbass was under his control of his stooges. And he's got Mariupol now to connect the two. Can he present, after the immense losses of men and material, and we won't know exactly how much he has lost, but I think most objective think tanks do put his losses rather high. After those immense losses of men, of material, and of prestige, Mr. Putin's claim to fame was that I had made Russia great again. Right? Well, that's one of the first casualties of the war in Ukraine. Now, after all those losses, political, material, is it enough for him to tell his fellow Russians, well, you know, we fought a good fight and we ended up where we were? More or less. I don't think so. Right? On the Ukrainian side, it's all very well for Mr. Zelensky to talk bravely, as he must, of pushing the Russians right out. Give us the job and we'll finish. Give us the tools to finish the job. I think this is also a bit of a delusion, as delusional as Mr. Putin's ability to push, to overrun Ukraine, which he does not recognize as a legitimate state. So we are stuck. I think there may be armistice of some kinds, temporary ceasefires, but even that will be difficult. Over the weekend, you must have read the news that the Turks, the UN, Ukrainians and the Russians had come to some kind of deal to allow grain to be shipped out of Ukrainian ports. I was extremely skeptical. I had been asked about this at a talk I gave, I don't think it's a secret, I gave to a bank on Thursday. And I said, I don't see what's in it for Russia. Why should they do Ukraine a favor? They are at war. Right? Then Saturday, I looked at it, there was this report. I said, okay, good. I'm wrong, because it would be a good thing if there was this deal. But pretty soon there was another report that the Russians had shelled Odessa, which is one of the main ports. So I think this is still up in the air. I think this is going to be, at best, a frozen conflict stopped by some sort of armistice. And do not forget, we have two examples of frozen conflicts, armistice, that have lasted a hell of a long time. And they're the Korean Peninsula and Kashmir. They lasted for 70 years. Now, I hope sincerely that this is not going to last as long as that. But frankly, I can't rule it out. Even if it is much shorter, and by much shorter, let's say, instead of 70 years, let's say 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years. As long as there are Russian troops on Ukrainian soil, or soil claimed as Ukrainian, sanctions will remain. I think it was correct to impose sanctions because the act of aggression against Ukraine was such an egregious example of complete disregard of some very fundamental norms of international relations. Now, those norms are very often, Russia is not the first to disregard them and will not be the last either. But this particular disregard was so egregious on such a large scale that there had to be some kind of response by countries opposed to it. So it's not wrong to impose sanctions, but I think we all did underestimate the impact of sanctions. Because sanctions have an impact not only on their targets, but on those imposing them. You see the effects of that on top of the effects of the pandemic, which we have not yet recovered from. We see it in disruptions to supply chains, further disruptions to supply chains, I should say. We see it in high energy price, we see it in high food price, and we see it in inflation generally. Inflation is going to be a new reality for the foreseeable future. I can't put a timeline to it. I think as we look at both the kinetic aspects of the war in Ukraine and the economic aspects, particularly the inflationary aspects, we have to understand that the period prior to the war in Ukraine was a very exceptional period. I look around the room, and I think Mr. Merle over there and me are the oldest people in the room. Many of you would have grown up politically, grown up professionally at a very unusual time in world history. Say from 1989, when the Berlin Wall came down, to around 2008, 2009, when the global financial crisis broke out. It was a very unusual time in two dimensions. The United States was clearly extremely dominant, and the scale of its the Cold War had just ended. The United States and its allies were so dominant that it masked a very fundamental reality. That reality being that competition among major powers is a characteristic of international relations. And that short period where there seemed to be no conflict was in fact an anomalous period. Historically short, about 30 years, that's not short in a person's life, but in history it's just a twinkling of an eye, an anomalous period. It coincided very largely to a period where, inflation wasn't really a problem. And stock markets people seem to think that stock markets had only one direction of movement, which is up and up and on and on. Right? The so-called great moderation, which had tamed the business cycle. Well, that's all over, I think, We are now back to a more historically normal period. And we'll have to live with it, both the economic and the geopolitical consequences. I'll be very brief about the geopolitical consequences. It has complicated U.S. China relations immensely. It has put China in a dilemma and confronted China with three irreconcilable goals. One, of course, China is neurologic about preserving certain fundamental principles as norms of international relations. Foremost among them is non-interference. Well, the invasion of Ukraine is clearly, taking non-interference, tearing into little pieces, opening the window and throwing all that complexity out. And the reason this is a problem for China can be summarized in 3 words. Those 3 words are Taiwan, Xinjiang, and Tibet. At the same time, China is now facing, for various reasons, we can talk about it, a period of slow growth, and there's many complicated internal problems that they have to deal with. They don't need extra problems, and they really don't need to get entangled in secondary sanctions by helping Russia. And they have actually, as far as I or anybody else can see, been rather cautious. Given Russia a lot of verbal support, but not so much material support. Although there have been 1 or 2, there was one 3 or 4 days ago in the Wall Street Journal, China supplying chips and other stuff. China is buying energy and some other stuff from Russia at bargain basement prices, and why not, right? But they're actually being rather cautious. But over the long run, the tensions on China, this balancing act it has to perform, will only get worse. But, and this is the third objective, it will not abandon Russia. It cannot abandon Russia. It cannot abandon Russia for the very simple reason China has no other partner of anywhere near Russia's strategic weight anywhere in the world. Look at who China's partners are. Pakistan. Pakistan is as much a liability as an asset. In this region, Laos, Cambodia, if that's the best you can do, you are not in such good shape. And go further to Africa, who are the partners of strategic weight. So you are going to have, but that's enough about the geopolitics. Let me say a few words about the economics of it. You're going to have a period of high food price, high energy price, and general inflation for the foreseeable future across the world. All of us will be affected by it. Singapore, Europe, the United States, Canada, all the developed countries, Japan. But the developed countries can generally deal with it. It's not very pleasant, but it can be dealt with. I'm much more worried about the less developed countries, and in particular those in the northern tier of the Middle East, from North Africa up through, Iran, Lebanon, up to Iran, Turkey. Turkey is actually a sound economy mismanaged. But in the rest of those things, you have very fragile economies, and not a few failed economies, although very few people there call them failed. But they are failed economies. You're telling me anybody's going to put Libya together again, or Lebanon together again, or Iraq for that matter, or Syria? Well, if you think you can put them together again, I had that bridge. Look at that bridge over there in the corner. That's actually mine, and I'll sell it to you for a very cheap price. So, for these countries, and Egypt, and Jordan, in that whole tier, there's only one really viable economy, that's Israel. Right? What will this high inflation pressure, high food pressure effect have on this? The obvious answer is political instability. Right? That will be also the case for many African countries who are already highly indebted for various reasons. The political instabilities of this will have an effect that I think we should keep an eye on, but it's quite pointless to try to speculate about what. About what the exact political effect will be. Although I will, and end here. If you look at the map, if there are going to be economic refugees from the northern tier of the Middle East or from Africa, where will they end up likely? Not in Singapore, in Europe. The last wave of of refugees drove European politics rightwards, what will this wave do? Now, I think Europe is going to have immense quarrels among themselves about how to deal with the Russians and how to deal with the fallout. You already see starting over energy. What sacrifices, how are the sacrifices going to be distributed? You have Portugal and you have Spain. If you had looked at the Financial Times yesterday, talking very fiercely. And there will be more quarrels. But in the end of the day, I think Europe will hold together because the Russian threat is an existential threat. They hold together well enough, so we shouldn't get too distracted by these quarrelsome. Europeans are quarrelsome people. The nature of their political system is intended to enhance and amplify quarrels. And that's one of the mistakes that Mr. Putin made. Mr. Putin and Mr. Xi Jinping, by the way, I think fundamentally do not understand Western systems because they come from political cultures where good government is equated with strong central government. Mind you, most countries in this region have the same political culture, variants. But Western political cultures are based on a different idea that too strong government is not to be trusted, and therefore power is to be distributed. And there are many disadvantages of this. It takes a long time sometimes to get your act together, but you can get your act together, as we can see in Ukraine. And you can hold your act together. Now I'll stop here and take your questions.
Hello, my name is Maria. I'm from CNBC Indonesia.
Yeah.
Maybe my first question is how close we are from globalization because of the war. And then emerging market like Indonesia, we got much benefit from the raise of commodity price, especially coal, but for how long do you think it is? And since we have signed, most of the countries have signed and committed at the Paris Agreement for zero emission in 2050, you think it's still relevant or it might got delayed? Thank you.
I'll start with your last question first because it's the easiest and it's freshest in my mind. I think the immediate effect of the Ukraine war will make it even harder for anybody to meet their Paris commitments to reduce carbon emissions. That's a fact. Everybody needs energy. Everybody is going for coal and other dirty energies. However, the longer term impact will be to hasten the energy transition, I think. Because it was a shock to the energy markets. It raised price. People in the emergency reached for the familiar tools of coal, or the dirty tools, right? But it also draw attention to the fact that it's not such a great idea to be too overly dependent, right? And I think the longer term, don't tell me how long it will take, right? But the immediate effect, the Paris Agreement commitments, even without the war in Ukraine, were probably not going to be met anyway. Put it this way, right? The war in Ukraine makes it certain they're not going to be met. But the longer term effect of the war in Ukraine, as people think about it, and think of ways to make themselves less vulnerable, is going to hasten the transition to alternative energies. That's the first question, I think. Your second question, what were your other questions?
Indonesia.
Sorry, what about Indonesia?
Commodity price.
Commodity price are high.
And we got much benefit from it, actually.
You got much benefit, but you also got some downsides. You got inflation, right? You got inequality, which was always there but enhanced by the pandemic, and I suspect will be enhanced further. All these are actually political problems. And you got an election not too long away. So you got a pretty volatile situation in Indonesia. Politically, I happen to think personally that you can manage it, right? Pak Jokowi Jokowi is managing it pretty well, I think. So I don't think Indonesia, in Southeast Asia, Indonesia is not one of the countries I'm overly worried about, put it this way. I think you can manage. Yeah, all you said is true. You have certain high commodity price, which is what? Your energy price basically, right? But you don't have that much energy. Your rupiah is fairly stable the last time I checked. I checked, right? But you are going to have some inflation. Your wheat, your energy, your price of wheat. I mean, Indomie is practically the Indonesian national dish, you know. Right? So, Indomie is wheat. Right? So, you balance out, and I don't think you will come out bad. You will come out clearly advantageous. But I don't think you're going to be clearly disadvantageous either. But there are problems you're going to have to deal with. Problems are going to be dealing with high food price. You're going to have to deal with other things driving inflation too, and the consequence of that, which is inequality, more inequality, I should say. And that's all political problems.
So we don't have to worry about recession.
No, that's the third level. I think the world is headed for a recession. Right? A couple of months ago, I gave a talk to the World Bank people in Singapore. There's a big office here. And it started by saying they had just put out their estimate for the world, right? So they asked me, what did you think? I said, I thought you were all too optimistic. Because they had lowered everybody's forecast. But they didn't use the R word. Whereas I think it's almost certain there's going to be a recession. How big, how deep, I don't know. But it would be remarkable to me if there was no recession. And it's a global recession, not just for Indonesia or for Singapore or for Malaysia. Right? So I think we should brace ourselves. Hopefully it won't be a very long one.
This year?
We might just, by the skin of our teeth, avoid a recession this year. But next year, I'm not so sure. I'm talking about global recession. Huh?
But probably it's in a silent, right?
Sorry?
But it's possible that it happens.
No, it could happen. I said, I hope possible. By the skin of our teeth, we just miss a recession. But if we miss it, we kind of technical miss, you know. Right?
I think this year probably there are so many countries that, plunging into recessions, right?
Yeah.
Technically, of course.
Huh?
Technically recession.
Yeah, but technical recession
Yes.
is still a recession.
Yes.
And the sum of many technical recessions is a recession.
Already happened, yes.
So I am not very hopeful.
Yeah, me too.
Okay, where are you from?
Indonesia.
Both of you. But it's not just Indonesia, you know. It's all of us.
Yes.
Could you comment on the image of Putin, the bold image that Putin had before the war? How the war has actually affected his image among his allies, and also the role that being played by leaders like Jokowi or Erdogan on resolving the conflict. How far could they go? Do you think that they will make an impact in resolving this?
Hey, let me say a word about Putin first. I think it's clear that he miscalculated in a spectacular way. He overestimated the capability of his own troops. He underestimated the capability of the Ukrainians to resist. And above all, he underestimated the ability of Western countries to coalesce and resist in a pretty short time. With the results you see. Putin's miscalculations have sometimes been attributed to his insanity. That he's mad, you know. I don't think he's mad. That's a very simplistic and a cop-out, actually. He did miscalculate. But he exists in a system where there is a single point of failure. Everything leads to Putin, and what Putin says goes. And that kind of system is very, very vulnerable to miscalculations because of the quality of information being fed through the single point of failure. I think some of you have seen the video of Putin berating and humiliating his intelligence chief. Right? Now, if you do make a habit of doing this, shouldn't be too surprised if the intelligence you get, well, the technical term for the intelligence you get if you do that is shit. Alright? Right? Look, it's quite clear that they did not plan for a long war. If you cannot supply your armor with ammunition, with fuel, with your soldiers with food and ammunition over 70 kilometers, you have that means you have no plan. I think he basically did believe that his troops would be welcomed in Ukraine, and the war would be very short, so they didn't really plan for a war. Having deceived himself, it looks to me that he deceived his buddy Xi Jinping. We'll never know what was discussed when that led to the 4 February joint communique between Russia and China. But I can tell you that when I read that phrase about no limits to the partnership, I said to myself, there's no professional diplomat either in Russia or China, and I know quite a number of them, and they are quite good diplomats actually. Bad cause, but good diplomats who would have agreed to that if they had been asked. Right? Because it's really stupid. I told my wife, and I'm still alive as you can see, even in a marriage there must be limits. How can you have no limits in a diplomatic partnership, right? And you know, one having deceived himself, deceived the other, and brought them both into a strategic failure. Now, Erdogan and Jokowi has, I think, what he has in mind is the G20 summit, primarily, right? And he's pretty clever because he brought Erdogan on board, which makes it difficult for the other, for the Europeans and Americans to boycott the summit, right? And actually, I am, in general, I'm not one that thinks that anything useful is achieved by boycotting any summit. Because all it does is to give you a moment of feeling very proud of yourself, but it doesn't really achieve anything. Okay, right? Right? It makes you feel so virtuous for about 2 minutes, and then after what? No. Yeah. So I hope his tactic works, but I'm not that hopeful because you see how the finance ministers work, right? I mean, what's his goal? Will he want to peace in Ukraine? No, forget it. That's beyond his capabilities. But I think there will be some utility in having a meeting under Indonesian chair, which is a very neutral chair, and having a discussion.
Cooling down the tension, right?
I don't know whether it cool down the tension or raise it, but I think a discussion for the sake of a discussion has some utility. In any case, under the circumstances, that's about all that a G20 summit can be expected to achieve. Right? Erdogan is another piece of work. He is, on the one hand, he got a very shock of his life, and he scurried back to NATO. Because Russia is their hereditary enemy, right? And he needs NATO to deal with Russia. So there has been a reorientation of Turkish strategic outlook back in alignment with NATO. And then he has taken some rather bold initiatives just to, for example, to blockade Russian ships. And he has played a role in this grain deal. So he wants to refurbish his image actually as a reliable and responsible country, right? Because it had taken quite a beating over the last few years. Well, his last initiative about grain, I told you, it was a good thing. I was personally very skeptical because I couldn't see why Russia should do Ukraine or anybody else a favor. But there is one reason, there's one more dimension of all this, right? There is a war fought on the ground in Ukraine, but there is a war fought in all our heads on Ukraine, and that's an information war. Lavrov is headed out to Africa. Lavrov was my colleague once in the UN. He's a very brilliant diplomat. You know? He has no sense of strategy, but he's the most brilliant tactical diplomat I've ever met in any country. And I can see what his mission would be. His mission would be to confuse the issue.
Next question to Shakur.
Hi, my name is Shakur. I'm from Press Trust of India, New Delhi. So, by the turn of the century, we all thought that the conventional military wars were over. I mean, the era of conventional military wars were over. But what we see in Ukraine, and for that matter in Yemen or other conflict zones across the world, do you think the more the things change, the more they remain same, as far as geopolitics is concerned?
Who are these people who thought that conventional military was over? It wasn't me, by the way. I don't know. I think that was a delusion. It was a delusion for a number of reasons, primarily because of the way the Cold War ended. It left the United States so dominant for a short period, as I said earlier, that it masked this reality that great power competition is a fundamental reality of international relations, whether you like it or not. And we are back to a normal period, and we just have to learn to live it. The problem is this. I would dare say the vast majority of people in this room, listening to me, participating in this program, came to political maturity only during that exceptional period which we have thought is the norm. It's not the norm. You grow up in an exceptional period. Thank your lucky stars for it, but then look forward, it's not going to be like that anymore. So I think that's this psychological change of gear is something that we need to make throughout the world. Because we have dealt with major power competition before. U.S. Soviet Union, for example. And we have dealt with it pretty successfully. But now we have a more complicated situation. But we can deal with it, provided we don't fall into provided we understand it for what it is and we don't fall into a kind of fatalistic frame of mind.
Next question goes to Ben.
Hi, Ben Westcott from Bloomberg in Australia. You talked before about the fact that China can't abandon Russia, which is almost certainly correct. But given the fact that Russia's going to probably find itself in a more reduced capacity even than it was before, reduced capacity after the war, it's going to find itself, even a less impressive power probably than before. Is it possible that that could complicate China-Russia relations as Russia begins to chafe under sort of being the lesser partner to the Chinese government in the years ahead?
Well, if you look carefully, Russia has never been particularly happy at being the lesser partner, even before the war in Ukraine. Okay? But I think for them to break, it's wishful thinking rather than strategic analysis. Russia is going to be diminished. Russia would have been diminished even if there's no war. The war would accelerate that. The demographic factors, Look, I said just now, I think the immediate impact of the war would be to enhance our reliance on fossil fuel of various types. But the long-term effect will be to accelerate the transition, the energy transition to alternative energy, because nobody wants to be stuck on, be overly dependent here and there. And that will also mitigate against Russia because its economy is basically resource and weapons. Having looked at the performance of the Russian army, I think the demand for those weapons will not be robust, shall we say. Right? There will be countries like India and Vietnam that has a large stock and they can't get rid of them overnight, right? Like that. But I think the trajectory is also downwards. But big countries have very long trajectories. So for the foreseeable future, Russia is a strategic factor. It's a permanent member of the UN Security Council. Can cause a lot of mischief that way too. But I think you're right. It is going to be a heavier and heavier millstone around the Chinese neck. And China has nobody else. What was the other part of your question?
I mean, that's basically it. I mean, do you think that Russia, rather than being sort of an asset as it has been to a degree over the past 5 years or 10 years, will become something of a headache for China more?
It will be a headache for China. I think it will be, and China will try to do the minimum with Russia because it doesn't want to it's got a complicated enough relations with the West. Right? Both Russia and China will go and play all kinds of games in what we used to call the third world. Middle East, Africa, Latin America. And they'll probably be pretty successful there because one thing the West doesn't understand is that in these regions, including in Southeast Asia, I think while the principle is understood, attitudes are nonetheless very ambivalent. In any case, the principle is kind of abstract one since the conflict is fairly far away. But the consequences of the conflict, whether in high food price, high energy price, general inflation, more inequality, these are here and now. And these are going to be more politically salient aspects of the conflict rather than the principle. So the games that you will see China and Russia play in Africa, in the Middle East, and they will have resonance. In fact, we have resonance in this region. We should not deceive ourselves on that. But in the end, can all this make up? China is much more invested into the current world order than Russia ever is. Right? Russian economy is about the size of South Korea's economy or Italy's economy, and much less sophisticated than either South Korea or Italy. But China is the world's largest economy or world's second largest economy. You can't possibly shun that. I was in U.S. in April, and some American friends right-wing American friends were rather gleeful. Look at all this stuff we have done to Russia, we can do it to China. I told you, don't be delusional. I told them just that Russia is about the size of South Korea or Italy and much less sophisticated. And they are already causing so much disruptions. You try to put that kind of tensions, that kind of sanctions on China, we all die. And that brings me to, I think, a quick point I want to make. One of my personal bugbears is the description of U.S. China strategy. Step one back. Russia is not the main issue. The main issue is China. Whatever the West is doing to Russia in Ukraine is intended to send a message to China, ultimately. You see it very clearly at the NATO summit, Madrid NATO summit, right? You see it at the 4 Asia Pacific countries attending the NATO summit. But when you talk about U.S. China competition or Western China competition, I think we should describe it correctly. It irritates me no end whenever people call it a new Cold War, because I think that's a fundamentally inaccurate way of describing U.S. China competition. The U.S. and the Soviet Union each led separate systems which were connected to each other only very tangentially, only at the margins. But the US and China are vital, irreplaceable components of a single global system. And they are connected to each other and to the rest of us actually, right? By supply chains of a density and a complexity and a scope they have never before seen in world history. There were supply chains in the past, but nothing of the density and the complexity. And that distinguishes 21st century interdependence from earlier periods of interdependence. And I don't think this single system, despite the tensions that have arisen from the competition, is going to bifurcate into two separate, entirely separate systems. There will be partial bifurcation in certain domains. Internet is largely bifurcated. And there will be other bifurcations. But complete separation into two systems, I think this is highly unlikely, because it imposes cost to both. Now, competition within a system is fundamentally different from competition between two systems, as was Cold War. For one, I don't think it will end in any clear-cut denouement. It's not going to be somebody won, somebody lost. I don't think so. Secondly, it's far more complex. It's not binary.
Comment? Oh, I'm sorry. Were you still?
Right?
Were you done with the second?
Yeah.
Okay.
My name is Mohammed Daoud Khan and I'm from Pakistan. I work for Pukhtunkhwa Radio, a network cabinet community radio station along with border with Afghanistan.
Mm-hmm.
My question is that when it's come to the Middle East, Kuwait and Iraq war and then Saddam and then Afghanistan, so all the NATO are on the one page and they are using jet aircraft, B-52, drone attacks and a lot of things in Afghanistan and Iraq. But now in Ukraine, we have seen a very different situation. So why the NATO is so silent?
NATO is not silent. NATO is supplying weapons. NATO members are supplying weapons. And the reason is very different. I think the fundamental mistake that Ukraine did is to give up its nuclear weapons it inherited from the Soviet Union. But Russia still has it. Nuclear deterrence applies in the war in Ukraine. No nuclear deterrence applies in the Middle East yet. Simple.
But apart from the weapons, they also use the West media and even the Hollywood to build narrative against the
Yeah, but war has always been many dimensional, and war in the 21st century, the war of narratives is as important as the kinetic war. This is how it is, No point. I know what you mean. It's not fair. But where has fairness ever had anything to do with war? The point about war is to make it as unfair as possible and win as quickly as possible. But you raised an interesting question. Look, 50 years ago, the US made a serious mistake by directly intervening in Vietnam. It rectified its mistake, it corrected its mistake, and since then has pursued the strategic posture of an offshore balancer rather than a direct intervener in East Asia. And been very consistent in that role. US made mistakes in Afghanistan and in Iraq, and is correcting those mistakes. and shifting to the posture of an offshore balancer in the Middle East. That is the larger meaning of the Abraham Accords. The Abraham Accords means mainly the U.S. telling the Gulf states, Israel, I do not think that Iran is an existential threat to me. If you guys think it is an existential threat to you, better get yourself together and deal with it. I am still here, I'm not running away. My Air Force is still in Qatar. My Fifth Fleet is still in Bahrain. And if I see a bad guy that I think threatens me somewhere, as you mentioned, I can easily reach out and kill him. But I'm not going to get involved unless my interests are involved. Dealing with this offshore balancer is an entirely different issue than dealing with a country that's prepared to intervene directly. It's something that the Middle East countries are not yet comfortable with, but they will learn.
Shruti?
I'm Shruti from Bloomberg, Delhi. This question is regarding one of the observations you made that China has too many problems of its own domestically to not find new, ways to further, take on challenges. So this is in context of India and China conflict. We saw in 2020 what happened, the border dispute, and that has continued. Both the countries have maintained their position at the border. Now, if China is not looking to further escalate, its problems, where do you see this India-China border problem heading after Ukraine-Russia war? And India has, ever since the war, India has tried to be close to Russia. It has been buying oil. It has not really, it has condemned the action, but it has not really given up its friendship, right? So do you ever see in the future China, Russia, and India, in the context of Quad, of course, China, India, and Russia coming together as a bloc?
No. Simple answer is no. No. I think China and India are nuclear powers. That imposes a certain degree of stability on the relationship at a very high level. You are quite interdependent because your trade, despite all the problems in the Himalayas, your trade flourishes, right?
Yeah.
Not always to the great joy of Mr. Modi, but it flourishes. So actually it's a very good illustration of the more complex types of relationships that develop when the international competition is within a single system. The competition between between India and China is real. So it's a trade. So it's not a very binary kind of relationship. So but to your exact question about any kind of prospect of India, China, and Russia, oh yeah, that's a fantasy. Even the BRICS is dead.
Just one more question on this. Yeah, you also said that, of course, inflation is going to be a reality in the foreseeable future. But in India, we have high inflation, which has, of course, given rise to, high inequality. But still, we don't see political instability. What explains that?
Repression? Or maybe not enough time yet. There has been kind of political instability. To me, I see political instability. Perhaps you are Indian, your tolerance for political instability is much higher. And you don't see this as anything more than business as usual. I don't know.
No, because there's a very strong government dynamic.
Yeah, strong government, that's why I meant by, repression.
To your right.
So, I'm Thu from Vietnam. You can see that in the first place, the Russians said that they would just want to free the people in Donbass. But now the Russian foreign minister, he said that Russia want to change the regime in Ukraine. And so, what do you think why there's a change in their purpose? They really want to invade Ukraine. And the second question is, how you see the world economy will change after this conflict? Will there be another financial system to, to replace SWIFT, for example? And the third question is, if the Russia win this war, how the position of U.S. change economically?
Okay, first of all, I don't think it is possible for Russia to win this war. The war is lost. Politically, it's already lost. Why did he start the war? Because just read some of Mr. Putin's writings. He does not believe that Ukraine, an independent Ukraine, is a legitimate state. Right? If he stops on Donbass, it is only because he couldn't go further. Right? What?
Now he could go further outside.
No, I don't think he can. He's at the I believe he's at the limit of his capabilities. You must have read here and there the difficulties there are in replacing men. Right now, they are willing to recruit men up to the age of 60 on fairly generous contracts, provided you don't get killed. You can get quite a lot of money. He's going to have difficulty not just replacing men, replacing the equipment that was destroyed. Because this equipment, as I have read, contains Western components. Right? So it's in some trouble. He's not going to stop, that's for sure. Right? And and Russians historically have had very high tolerance for enormous casualties. Right? But I don't think he can win. I don't think it's therefore going to lead to any fundamental restructuring of the world economy. People are going to be more cautious about their supply chains. They're trying to build more resilience into their supply chains to avoid over-dependence on, on one source or another, whether it's China or Russia or everything. One of the things that we have learned from the pandemic, and we will continue to study after this, is I had a couple of friends who are businessmen, and they told me basically, look, they didn't know their own supply chain until it got disrupted. Okay? Because it's a kind of misleading image. Supply chain, you think is like a chain, right? One thing. Actually, it's like a tree, a branch, because all things fit in the supply chain. And some little whiz-ball out here was disrupted, everything else is disrupted. And one of my friends said, I really didn't know where I was getting all this stuff. Or I was connected to all this stuff until I couldn't get it. Right? Now, we'll try to make sure it is going on as we speak, that these vulnerabilities will be mitigated as much as possible. But I don't think you can separate them. You can't have perfect self-reliance. It's going to be as difficult for us to reduce dependence on these supply chains connected to China or Russia as it is for Mr. Xi Jinping to become more self-reliant in certain technologies. All these things are much easier said than done. And even if you can do it, it takes a long time to put into place. So I think we are stuck as we are. I think the global system is under immense pressures from the war, from the hangover of the pandemic, from effects that we do not yet know, but will eventually manifest themselves. But I think it will hold together in a suboptimal way. Or somebody behind you.
Hi, I'm Kritika. I'm from the Associated Press, based in New Delhi. So as should be mentioned, India has continued to buy a lot of Russian crude, but at the same time, despite record purchases, it's been continued to be courted very well by the West. I just wanted to know, how do you see India's position in this playing out long term? Because in the beginning, there was concerns of punitive measures being put against India from the US. But all of that has faded away, and it seems like India is continuing to not just benefit economically with its continued tie with Russia, but also the West has pretty much left it to do its thing. And I just want to
I don't think the West has left you to do your thing, but I think the West understands the position you're in India, in the sense that you have an enormous stock of Russian Soviet-era weapons that has to be kept operational because of your concerns about China. Right? You have no choice. Even if you wish to diversify away from your current stock, it's so huge, it will take a very long time. Now, I think, and I was a little bit surprised that the West understood that.
Yeah.
Right? Understood that. And I don't think, I think the understanding will continue. No. This is under the Biden administration. You might get a less patient administration. Let's say if a Republican, rather right-wing Republican comes. But I don't think the fundamental trajectory is going to change. Nobody's going to come and, you may face more pressure to diversify at a faster pace. But I don't think anybody's going to punish you for not doing it, because you are an important strategic actor in the Quad and so on, and in your own right. So I think you are in a good position. Now, what are you going to use that position to do? That's the thing. If I was Indian, I would buy the time that has been bought for you to try to put into place a better procurement system. Because one of the reasons you move very slowly is you have actually an illogical and dysfunctional procurement system for weapon system. Okay? Alright? So if you could do something about that, and then you can buy more time because people will be seeing that you are doing something serious.
When you say better procurement system, like
We have no procurement system now. We have a procurement system. Nothing that I would call a procurement system. No, you have no way to, in an integrated way. No, first of all, you don't have a joint staff. It's a retirement post. Somebody holds it for 6 months or what, has a few more medals, and then goes off, right? And each service puts its own requirements. Right? And then the reconciliation is done by who? It's done by, not by service professionals, it's done by some civilian bureaucrat who's put there because Nehru had some fear of coup by the army. I don't believe the Indian army is capable of pulling a coup of one stool. Right? But there is that fear. It took me a long time to understand this about India. That it's all boycott, but my Indian friends told me, no, they was scared of coup. Are you sure? I mean, it took me a long time and therefore he put into place structures that are totally illogical to prevent a possibility that I don't see happening anyway. Right? You need that kind of reform, then you can reorientate your armed forces more quickly.
Sorry, just one quick follow-up. So you mentioned the military dependence that's going to take a long time to diversify.
Yeah.
But now it's becoming, I don't know if I'd use the word dependent on Russia for oil, but it is continuing to buy oil. So it's
If I were you, I'd buy these bargain-based prices. But I think Russia, what is it? 10% of your energy needs? That's 5%. I think it's 5%. Yeah, 5% of the energy needs. So that's not very much, And I don't see, right now this is fire sale. So you might as well buy as much cheap oil and, stockpile it somewhere. You'll be nuts if you don't, If your bureaucrats don't do it, you ask more, some of the Gujaratis, other people who are more business like us, you go and do it for them. No, but I don't think you are very keen, that is, to become overly dependent on Russian oil. But right now, I don't think China is overly keen to be dependent on Russian oil. But like you, if there's a fire sale, you must take as much as you can,
Final question goes to Mo.
My question is on developing countries.
What countries?
Developing countries.
Okay.
Some of the developing countries are in a financial crisis already,
Yeah.
and impact of Russia-Ukraine war may worsen. There is a fear that impact of Russia-Ukraine war may worsen the financial crisis of some of the developing countries because debt financing and budget financing, they are going to the multilateral development lending agencies, and internal borrowing is increasing fast. So, do you suggest them to borrow more from multilateral development lending agencies or internal borrowing? What would be better for them? And do you is it rational to borrow from multilateral development agencies in this stage for the developing countries?
Those who have got into trouble, Sri Lanka comes to mind. You have Laos in a very similar precarious situation in this region. Borrowed imprudently. They borrowed for projects that it was dubious that any of these projects could make a return in the first place, right? And I'm told some African countries are in similar positions. I'm told maybe Nepal might be in that position. Bangladesh is probably in a sounder position because it's got a economy is quite and Pakistan is perpetually in this situation. Argentina is perpetually in this situation, and there are some others, right? I really don't know how to answer your question. Because if your question is it wise for them to borrow internally from multilateral institutions rather than internally? Do they have a choice to borrow internally? Some countries don't have a choice, right? Because they are poor countries. They're not much internal.
In Bangladesh, internal borrowing is a high cost borrowing because rate of interest is quite higher than that of multilateral development agencies. But when we take loan from multilateral development agencies, some conditions they impose that may feel some harsh conditions that we face difficulties to comply with.
I think, I don't know, I'm not an expert on this, but my common sense tells me you go and borrow where the interest rate is lower and the conditions can be discussed. And if you get into trouble, your multilateral institutions are, you're talking about ADB, World Bank, these kind of institutions, right? Will probably be, they will try to impose conditions, but they can be discussed with. Whereas if you borrow from say you borrow from China. China has not done one thing to help Bangladesh. I doubt it will do very much to help Laos if there's a trouble. I read somewhere Ghana, I think, has got large Chinese debt. The Chinese are a new lender on the international thing, right?
Yeah.
So a very new lender, and I don't think they buy into the norms of, say, Paris Club and things like that, right? So I would rather borrow. If I was a developing country faced with the need to borrow, I would go and borrow for established financial institutions, even if it costs a little more. And I would borrow for things that can create a return. I'll tell you a story, and I think I better stop, right? I don't think, by the way, all the Chinese institutions are so happy being made to lend to some of these countries. A few years ago, went to go and take a look at Hambantota in Sri Lanka. Because I went there because a Chinese scholar had told me that the SOE, who had been told to take over Hambantota when the Sri Lankans couldn't pay their debt, was not very happy at being asked to take over Hambantota. So I went to have a look at it, and I understood immensely, immediately. Because Hambantota was a very nice port, not a very big port, but a nice port. One small problem, no ships. And then there was no security to I just walked to the port and look around, right? And everybody's very friendly, I guess, because they have nobody to talk to for the whole time, right? So some weird fellow just ambling in, everybody very happy to talk to him, right? And then I went to the airport. So there's no planes. Nice airport, by the way, but no planes. So I went back to Singapore and I asked some of my friends who are in the logistics business. Then he looks at me and he says, "You people in the government don't know anything important." I said, "That's probably true, but what is this I'm missing this time?" He said, when he explained it, it became very, very obvious. Sri Lanka is a small economy. Right? Therefore, all goods shipped to Sri Lanka are for Sri Lanka. Right now, some very little, but very, very little is broken, cargo is broken and sent to South India. But those parts of South India where it's sent to are building their own ports. Right now in Sri Lanka, my friends tell me, has 3 ports. They have Colombo, they have Hambantota, they have Chikamuli. That's 2 ports too many, for the economy the size of Sri Lanka. So these ports are always going to be empty. Now, maybe the Chinese or whoever owns them have some idea of using them for military strategic purposes. Now that's what everybody says. But I can tell you, I know a little bit about the army since we all served in the army in Singapore until we were 50 years old. So I had to look at Hambantota Port. It cannot be defended. It's just open down there. There's no way to store your ammunition. There's no way to store, it can be destroyed in the first, say in the first 2 hours of a conflict, there will be no Hambantota Port. Right? So it's a white elephant. And I think that is probably true of a lot of BRI projects. BRI started in a whole burst of enthusiasm. And I was always very skeptical about it. Because it was such a wide-ranging project. Such a wide-ranging project that almost everything was called BRI project. Every damn thing, everywhere. So I was joking to a Chinese friend, if I get a Chinese contractor to come and renovate my apartment, will it be a BRI project? It may be, because if the guy wanted to bring money out of China, it might have been, So I came to the conclusion that BRI is an ambitious vision, right? And there's nothing wrong with big countries having big, ambitious visions. In fact, the opposite would be unusual. If a big country had only very modest visions, okay, that would be rather strange. But it's really a collection of projects, a collection of individual projects, covering a huge range of areas, geographical range too, wrapped up in a slogan, presented as a strategy. And you already see what's happening. Not all these projects are viable. Some are being scaled down, some are being abandoned, some being restructured, and that's natural. Not all of them will work. And I have told American friends, look, if the Chinese want to run this port in Italy or this port in Greece, why not? Somebody's got to run the damn port, right? Okay, they want to run the port in Haifa, which is next to Israel's main naval base. That's another matter. But run the port in Italy, port in Greece, so what? What harm does it do? Somebody's got to run that port. Might as well be the Chinese. Anyways.
Bilahari, thank you so
there's
much.
one more. Let me ask you this. Then I gotta go. Yeah. That's you. Yeah.
Just you can
Just speak
ask.
loudly. Speak loudly.
This is Ram Sakuda from Nepal. you already said like that there is a competition between U.S. and China.
Yeah.
And Nepal is, China is a neighboring country of
Yeah.
Nepal. So do you think like Nepal can be or is a strategic region for U.S. to deal or pursue something for China? Because Nepal's parliament already passed the NCC bill to the parliament, and Nepal already is in the Belt and Road initiative by China. So do you think Nepal is in a strategic region for U.S. to deal with China?
Well, I think to deal with China, you have to do two things. First of all, you have to make sure that whatever you do with China is in your own interest and not just Chinese interests. I can't advise you on that because I don't know what you're doing in China. Any project, right? Is it commercially viable? Does it serve Nepali interests? And then you will always find it easier to deal with China if you have the US, Japan, India, and other powers around. It's generally not a good idea to deal with any major power, whether it is China or the US, on an exclusive basis. That way lies trouble.
Bilahari, thank you so much for this
Oh.
conversation.
Okay.